in the year 2000, early 2000, it was my first church plant. And so I moved to the city of Brentwood, California, and started planting a church there and moving into a community. I didn't know anybody, so I was trying to get to know people. I was meeting with other pastors, visiting other churches, getting involved in ministerial associations. And I found out there was another church in our community that was planted, and it started just about 6 to 9 months before we did. And so I went to one of their services and met their pastor. So I was just out there getting to know people. But as time rolled along, a few years later, one of the church plants that had planted right before us began to have some problems. There were rumblings that people were leaving, that the senior pastor was a very strong, choleric personality, that he was sometimes driving people away. And so, the ministerial association was praying for him, and then there were other rumors about inappropriate relationships with women. And so the ministerial association tried to meet with him and to try to provide some accountability, and the church was bleeding people and it was collapsing. And so finally the elders or the board of that church got together and they said, based upon what we're hearing in our investigation and for the health of the church, we're going to be letting this pastor go. So they let him go. And the next Sunday, he wasn't there, of course, and the church began the process of healing, and what are we going to do now, and how are we going to find another pastor? And it was just kind of, trying to heal through this era. Well, the next Sunday, that strong personality pastor decided to show up. And in the middle of a worship service, when they're singing songs, that pastor and about 30 of his followers charged the stage. They walked in with a show of force, walked up upon the stage. The pastor snatched the microphone from one of the singers and said, "God has not released me yet. I'm still your pastor." So everyone was stunned. It was quiet. No one knew what to do. People started walking out. Someone called the police. And while he was up on stage yammering, his followers they had equipment, they were going, and they started changing out all of the locks so that they could lock everyone out and physically take control of the building. Because as you know, if you physically hold the building, you have to have a lawsuit to get it back, and that can take months and months and months. So the police were called. It was this big ordeal. It was such a big deal that it ended up in the local newspaper, and I had family members who were non-Christians asking me about what's going on with this church thing. And as you might expect, the church collapsed overnight. There was a series of lawsuits that went on for years and years, and the whole thing turned out to be a big nothing burger. It was just a complete waste of everyone's time and resources. Abraham Lincoln is famous for saying during the Civil War that a house divided cannot stand. Now, of course, he didn't come up with that saying. He's quoting Jesus, who said the same thing, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Whether it is a family or a government or a church, if it is divided against itself, it's not going to last very long. Notice he didn't say it might not stand, it probably won't stand. He said a house divided will not stand. Now this is the issue that Paul is addressing in Ephesians chapter 4. So if you would, I'm going to ask you to open up your Bibles there, turn your tablets, your phones to Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to be starting with verse 1. Just verses 1 through 6. Over the last couple of chapters, Paul has been dealing with the issue of the racial divide that was going on in this culture. In their culture, it was Jew and Gentile, and they weren't very good friends. And there were cultural differences, and there were language differences, and there were dress differences and food differences, and everything about them was different, and they were trying to come together as a single church, and Paul is calling them to unity. And so in this last section, Paul is going to address unity within the church directly. So we're in Ephesians chapter 4, starting with verse 1. This is from the ESV. This is what Paul says. "Therefore, as prisoner of the Lord, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Paul says in verse 1 that he wants us to walk in a way that is worthy of our calling. Now, in his vernacular, to walk means your conduct. He's not actually talking about how you're walking down the street. He's referring to conduct. He's urging you to have conduct in such a way that promotes unity. Now, if I could narrow everything that we're going to talk about down today to just one concept, it would be this: that we are to maintain our unity through our conduct and through our principles. It is through our conduct and through our principles that we can maintain unity. And so let's look at unity through conduct. The first thing he says in verse 2 is that you and I, Christians, men and women, boys and girls, we have to conduct ourselves with all humility. Now, we could do an entire message on humility, and we can't do that today, but I want to just give you a basic. When it comes to humility, I think we ought to begin with the idea that we could be wrong. And it's hard to do that. It is so easy. The snap reaction is to say, it's your fault, it's their fault, it's somebody else's fault, it's never our fault. That natural instinct is normal, but it's not necessarily the right one. And you see this in even small ways. You ever notice you're on the phone with someone, you're talking, and it starts to break up, and what do they say? They say, you're breaking up. How do you know it's me? Couldn't it be you? And I like it when you're on a landline and then they say, you're breaking up. No, I'm on a landline, you're breaking up, right? So what I try to do is use non-inflammatory language and say, it's breaking up, because that doesn't apply blame. No, this is just a small example, but you understand what I'm saying. It's like we proceed with the idea that we can never be wrong, and you're going to have to just spend all of this time proving to me that I'm wrong. Well, you know, when we think about a teacher-student relationship, I'm not talking about a vocational teacher, but anyone who's teaching anyone anything, or anyone who's telling somebody something. Hey, can you go run to the kitchen and get this, right? And the person runs to the kitchen and tries to get the object, and they can't find it, and then they go back, and the person who gave the command says, I told you where it was. What's the assumption? It's your fault. It couldn't be that I was a bad communicator. It couldn't be that I gave bad instructions. You didn't listen. And so as we conduct ourselves with all humility, I would just say on one point is be careful to begin with the assumption that you're right and the other person's wrong. Why not begin on a neutral ground and say, okay, I told you to get this and you couldn't find it. Maybe my instructions were bad. Why don't we just start at that point rather than immediately signing blame? So he says that we ought to conduct ourselves with all humility, and he also says in verse 2 that we ought to conduct ourselves in all gentleness. Now, if we are being warned to be gentle, it probably means there were some people in this church that weren't being gentle. All this to say that the urge to punch someone in the face, the urge to snap and shoot someone out, the urge to throw something on the ground, these are normal and natural, but what Paul is saying is I need your conduct to be supernatural. He wants us to conduct ourselves with all humility and all gentleness. Now, I like what Proverbs 15:1 says. It says, a gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. And do you know that most of the time people are going to mirror your conduct? So if there's a situation and it's getting heated and the elevation of anger is getting high, and you remember Proverbs 15:1, and then you come in with a gentle answer, oftentimes things will go down. Things will start to calm down based upon your conduct. But if there's a situation going on, it's heated, and you come in and, you just let them have it, it says a harsh word stirs up wrath, then you're going to elevate the level of anger and stress. That doesn't work every time, but generally speaking, people are going to mirror your conduct. So Paul says, conduct yourselves with all humility, all gentleness, and in verse 2, he says, conduct yourself with all patience. Now, just yesterday, I was supposed to be showing some properties to this lady I've never met. And she said she was going to text me the properties that she wanted to see, but she might not want to see them. She wasn't sure. She said she would text me. I never got any texts. The day goes by, no texts. And suddenly at 5 o'clock p.m., she calls me. And she's being very friendly, but I could tell something's wrong. And then finally she reveals to me that she's been texting me all day, and I never answered her. And she was frustrated because she wanted to get in to see a home. And I said, well, I never received a text from you. So at the end of the story, we find out that somehow she had programmed my number into her phone incorrectly and was texting out into the void, or some poor sap who had a number like mine. And what I really appreciated about her is that in her mind, I was ignoring her. In her mind, I had neglected her. In her mind, I had abandoned her. And yet she was still being nice. She didn't chew me out or yell at me based upon me abandoning her. And then we found out it was just a technological problem. And I was like, wow, you've really got a lot of patience. And I appreciated that, because most of the time people will just chew you out. You know, you never know what people are dealing with. Charles Stanley one time was preaching, and he was the pastor of a large church. Maybe he still is, I don't know. But in the front row, there was a guy, as he's giving his sermon, the dude starts to fall asleep. And so Stanley gets frustrated because, hey, I'm up here preaching and you're falling asleep. You can't even just stay awake for 30 minutes. And so he's frustrated. And after the service, the guy's still asleep. His wife comes up to him and says, hey, thank you for having us. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And she says, my husband, he's dying of cancer. He's got about 2 months left. And this was his bucket list thing, was to come hear you preach in person. And suddenly he's like, oh, I feel like a total jerk, right? And the point is that we don't know what people are up against. We don't know what they're facing. We don't know the things with which they struggle. We don't know. And so Paul says, I want you guys to conduct yourselves with all patience. We have different personality types, different life experiences, different presuppositions, different strengths and weaknesses, circumstances, daily chemical highs and lows, and I want you to be patient with each other. And then he says, verse 2, I want you to bear with one another in love. Now, the Greek word for bearing, it can mean to endure. It can also mean to suffer. You have people in your life that you have to bear with them in love. Maybe we'll change the translation. You have people in your life that you have to suffer with them in love. Difficult people. And if you have no difficult people in your life that do that, maybe you're the one that they have to bear with you. I don't know. But Paul says that this is normal behavior. This is normal conduct, that you're going to have people in your life that are frustrating, that are difficult, and you're going to have to bear with them in love. And then he says, verse 3, eager to maintain unity in the Spirit. Now, I like that word maintain. Notice that unity is never fully achieved. It's kind of like laundry or cleaning your house. It's never really done. It's something that has to be maintained constantly. And so in these first 3 verses, Paul lays out character virtues that if we put them into practice will help us maintain the unity within the body of Christ. What he's saying is that our conduct with each other will keep us together. But there is another thing that can act as a unifying glue, and in the next several verses, Paul wants us to unify around some central issues. He names off some abstract concepts that ought to bring us together under a common banner. And so these are things that no one else has but us. This is what he says, verse 4. He says that we are one body. Now, this is a reference to the church being a body, that we're all on the same team, we're on the same tribe, we're in the same wizarding house, however you want to describe it. He says we're all one body. And then he says in verse 4 that there's one Spirit, that each of us has been given the Holy Spirit if we've confessed Christ as Lord. And that Spirit that I have in me is in you also. And this brings us together. He says, verse 4, that we have one hope. Hope is about the future. And we're all looking forward to something. But as Christians, we have one ultimate hope, and that is for new and eternal life. He says, verse 5, that we have one Lord. That everyone at this church, whether you're white or black or rich or poor, whatever it might be, Jew or Gentile, we all serve the same Lord. And then he says, one faith. Faith is not simple belief, it's more. It's volitional assent. It is the acceptance of certain facts, but also the trust in them, which translates to conduct. And then he says, verse 5, that we have one baptism. Now, baptism is the first act of obedience in the life of a believer. When we confess Christ as Lord, then we get baptized, symbolizing the old person is dying and being buried, and the new person is coming up. And then he says, verse 6, that there is one God and Father over all and through all and in all. And it reminds us of what the Lord said through Moses, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Not only is he one, but there is only one. And so these concepts, these principles, these practices, that is one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God, these are the core issues that bring us together. These attributes are the aligning tendrils that hold us together as one. Jews and Gentiles, black and white, rich and poor, men and women, under Christ, we are all one. And so our best bet at maintaining unity is to have unifying conduct and then recognize these unifying principles. Now what I want to do is I want to take a few moments and flush out how some of this might work and how some of it may go wrong. What I want to do is I want to give you 5 signs that unity is breaking in your church, or 5 things that will very quickly break unity in the church. And the first one is fractures in the leadership. There is no quicker way to rip a church in half than by having the leaders rip themselves in half. And I want to encourage you, challenge you, that if you are a leader in any church, whether you're a deacon or an elder or a pastor or a staff member or a director or someone who's a leader and doesn't have an official position, but they still have influence, your position is so important. Because most of the time, when there's a fracture in a church, it comes down between the leadership. And so we have to do everything we can to keep it together, to work it out, to compromise on issues that can be compromised, and to deal with each other with this type of conduct, because if the leadership cracks, then the entire thing crumbles. The second thing is fractures over secondary theological issues. I've seen this happen before, where there are core issues that we should split over, but there are some issues that we shouldn't. And I've seen this before where people will argue over secondary theological issues like, you're a premillennialist, well, I'm a postmillennialist, let's fight about it, and then there's a fracture. Another thing would be rogue Bible studies, where you have someone who's a strong personality and they want to start their own Bible study, and maybe the church doesn't endorse it, but they do it anyway, and they kind of have their own group. And I was at a church once that actually had listed in the bulletin a women's chit-chat group. That's what it was called. And I thought, that's really a bad name. But we had some ladies that went to this Bible study and came back and reported on 2 separate occasions that it was just a big gossip fest. And so these are things that can tear a body apart. We can think about secret meetings where different groups are kind of meeting on their own to try to get their way. We think also about the illegitimate use of power. Now this is important. You know, a couple weeks ago I got pulled over by an officer. I had one light out and I was driving home at night, and I was actually right over there, and I was pulling up into the church parking lot, and I saw the officer pass me, and I was like, oh man. And I look at my rearview mirror, and he turns around, I'm like, dang. So I pull up right here, he pulls me over, I have a light out, and then I found out that someone had stolen the sticker on the back of my car that says the year, because those are really strong, they don't fall off, and so someone stole it to put it on their car. So anyway, he was really cool. But you know the thing about officers? They have limited power. They can't just pull you over for whatever reason. They have to have a reason to pull you over. So they've been given power by the state or by the city, but within that power there are limitations. And we want our officers to act within the realm of the authority given to them. So if you're out building a deck and it's not to code, the officer can't do anything about that because that's not his or her authority. But maybe somebody from the city can. So when it comes to church life, certain individuals have been given authority. Now I have right here in my hands some important documents. And actually, let me rephrase that. I have one of the most important documents at our church. These are our bylaws. Now this may seem kind of boring, like bylaws. That's like reading the fine print. What the bylaws are us getting together as a church and deciding how are we going to govern ourselves. And the bylaws lay out the authority that each person or each group has. And then behind the bylaws, I have our policies and procedures for the care of underage parishioners. So in other words, when we get together as a church, we have certain boundaries. And we say, okay, not everyone can work with children. We say that we have money coming in, and we have ways to handle our money that is safe and secure and that has accountability so that you can trust us. We have different staff members. So all this to say that we have written down how we are going to govern ourselves. And so I, as a pastor, don't have the authority to be like, well, I just want to take some money from the church and use it. I can't do that. I don't have the authority to do that. And one of the things that will be a sign of the breaking of unity is when people use their power in church illegitimately. They say, we've got the bylaws, we've got the rules, I'm just going to do it my own way. And that's when things really spiral out of control. And the last thing, signs that unity is breaking, or 5 things that will quickly break unity, is something called nepotism. Nepotism is a type of favoritism that is directed towards family, and you could even apply it to friends. Now look, if I'm in a family and I have wealth and I'm putting together my documents for the end of life, and I have money and I die, certain family members are going to get money and so on and so forth, right? With your family, you have the right to do that. One of the problems that we have in churches is that churches are filled with people who are family members. You have cousins and uncles and brothers and sons and daughters and people who have married each other. And so sometimes within a church body, there is favoritism towards family. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say you had, I'm going to pick on deacons because we don't have deacons, so I can pick on them. Let's say we had a deacon who was the chairman of deacons and a very influential man, and that deacon, say, had a daughter. And this daughter was particularly cantankerous, not very friendly. And we had this daughter in charge of the nursery. And so when guests came in, they had to deal with this woman who wasn't very friendly. And people are like, why is this woman here in this position? She's scaring people away. We received word that this family stopped coming to our church because they were tired of dealing with this angry woman who's working in the nursery. And someone says, well, we can't do anything about it. Why not? Well, because she's the daughter of that deacon who has a lot of influence, and if we ask her not to be in that position, then it could cause some trouble. Now, this is just one example. But my thought is, as church leadership, we don't serve our families, we serve the church as a whole, and that person would need to be asked to step down. We need to get someone who's a little more friendlier in that position, and let's find a place where you can serve that matches your personality. The danger is to simply have standards, but then when it's our friends and family, that we don't apply them in the same way. Now, this is what James says. James says, my brothers, do not show favoritism. Genesis 37, this is a reference to Jacob. It says, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. So outrightly and blatantly, Jacob liked one of his sons more than his others, and it says, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him. And as a church, when we show favoritism, when we say, here are the rules, but I like this person, so we're just going to we're not going to apply it, it will make people hate the one that makes that decision. So these are things that can tear apart a church quickly. Fractures in the leadership, fractures over secondary theological issues, rogue Bible studies, secret meetings, illegitimate use of power, and nepotism. The the final thing I want to say is that although unity is incredibly important, it is a secondary virtue. That there is a time to part fellowship. There is a time to split. When is that? Well, one would be over a theological issue, a core theological issue. A group of people saying, we reject the divinity of Christ, or some other core theological issue. There is a time to break. But also over divisive people. Now, let me tell you what the scripture says, and this goes against what people view as biblical Christianity. Titus 4:10, this is what Paul says. As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him. In other words, there is a time, if there is a person that's divisive, that's causing trouble, to say, you know what, you're not welcome here anymore, or we're not having anything to do with you. Now, under the guise of a watered-down version of love, someone might say, but that's not very loving. You shouldn't do that to someone. You should just love everyone and be kind and so on and so forth. But if it's loving to allow this person to come in here and cause trouble, then what does that say to the rest of the people who are suffering under this? The loving act is actually to remove that person. Of course, it says warn him once and then twice. But we're afraid of doing this because no one likes confrontation. And once again, if you ask a person to not come back, that person's always friends with someone or related to someone else, and it causes a big chain reaction. But Paul never once in this passage says, do this as long as it's comfortable. He says, if there is a divisive person, warn this person multiple times, and then have nothing to do with him or her. It's funny. John Piper related a story years ago where he's the pastor of a church, and he suspected that two staff members were having an affair with each other. He suspected this, but he knew he had to find out, and so he began investigating, and there were signs that this was happening, and then he brought some other people in, and there were signs that it was happening, and after they had enough evidence to really confront the people, they confronted them, and they actually confessed it and said, yes, we did it, we were caught. And what caught John Piper off guard was that even though they were doing this, and they were confronted biblically, and it was handled as well as possible, and the people even confessed to it, a bunch of their friends and family never forgave John Piper for confronting them. They never let it go. They never released their anger that you confronted my brother, my cousin, my friend for this act of adultery. And so there is a time to break. There is a time to break over central theological issues. There's a time to break over with divisive people. And there's a time to break when there is immoral behavior. Now, yesterday, I had the pleasure of consuming Eggs Benedict. Anybody like Eggs Benedict, or is that just me? There's like 5 people? Okay. So you've got this English muffin with the egg on top of it over easy, and then you've got the hollandaise sauce, right? And it's pretty good. It's a strong flavor. I wouldn't want to eat it all the time, but every once in a while it's really good. And I was thinking about the hollandaise sauce, that essentially it is oil and lemon juice. Now, if you know anything about chemistry, which I don't, I know that oil and lemon juice do not mix. If you put them in the same cup, they're immediately going to separate, and so you really can't have a sauce with both oil and lemon juice in it unless you have what is called an emulsifier. An emulsifier will take 2 chemicals that cannot mix and bring them together, and in this case, it's egg whites. You see, the egg whites come in and grab the oil on this side and then grab the lemon juice on this side and then brings it together and makes it as one so that I can have Eggs Benedict. But this is exactly what Jesus does. He takes people that are different. You've got men and women, you've got rich and poor, you've got white and black, you've got Jews and Gentiles, you've got Republicans and Democrats, you've got people in the city, people in the country, people from this country, people from that country. All these different people who do not mix together, and in the center of them stands Jesus, who is the emulsifier, and he brings us together to form one unified body. But in this case, Paul gives us two specifics. He says, it is your conduct that is going to maintain the unity in this body, and it is the principles under which you stand. He says, if we can do that, then we will be a healthy, functioning body who will be able to do what Paul says next in verse 7, but we're not dealing with that today. We'll deal with that next week. But we can't do verse 7 and verse 8 and up to 12 unless we have verses 1 through 6. Now, ultimately, if you look at this list of conduct, it says humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, eager to maintain the unity. We don't have the power to produce that conduct in our lives. I don't have the power to be humble, to be patient, to bear with one another. So I need to have a change of heart in order to be this way. I need power to be this way. So where does that come from? Well, it's easy. Jesus gave up himself. He died on the cross and gave himself up to forgive us of our sin. And so we stand before God as broken people, people who have rebelled against God, people who deserve death. And so what Jesus did is he died on that cross. He paid for that sacrifice so that we can have new life. And when we confess him as Lord, when we say, I'm tired, I'm done fighting, I give my life to you, then he calls us a son, a daughter, his spirit fills our lives, and then he takes us on as a project to develop our character and make us more like him and give us power to have the conduct that we need to keep the unity. So God has provided everything for us here. He's provided change in our hearts so that we can produce this conduct, and then he's provided this conduct so that we can have unity. And in unity, then we can move forward as a church.